So we learned about stub global. Of course, now that we know how we can test code that uses this fetch function, we can also write more tests. And we could, for example, check whether our code really does convert the provided data that we pass into send data request, so our test data, into JSON before it's sending it, or as a process of sending it to the backend. So I might want to test if I do have JSON stringify here. Because the real fetch function would fail to send a request if we pass unstringified data to it, if we don't pass JSON data. Our test here with our own test function would work, just as a side note. If I pass data to this fetch function like this in my production code, then if I run npm test, the test I wrote until now still works. But this should not work, and to prove this, I'll leave it like this and now write another test, where I want to test that my own function should convert the provided data to JSON before sending the request. And to test this, I will again copy my test data from the previous test. Alternatively, we could set it up as a global constant, of course, but here I'll just copy it. And then what I want to do here is I want to find out whether the data was passed as JSON to the fetch function. And since I'm using my own fetch function here, I can of course add some code to it that does in the end allow me to find out whether the data was transformed. And what I will do here is I will go to this promise, which I have here, and I'll check if options.body, because we set the body of the outgoing request on a body key, if that is maybe not of type JSON. So I will check if options.body is not a string, which we can check with help of the type of operator, which is a standard JavaScript operator. And I'll check if this is not of type string. And JSON is in the end just text, so JSON would be of type string. So I'm checking if the body I received here is not a string, and if that's the case, I will reject the promise, and I'll return to not execute the rest of this code, and I'll reject with a message of not a string, something like this. That's one way of checking whether the data was transformed to a string, so presumably to JSON. And then with that change made, we can go down here to our testing code and now return expect and send our request, of course, again, dot not rejects, because we don't want this to reject. And then we could pass an error message here or just not expect it to reject at all. And now here, I then want to make sure that when this rejects, it rejects to a string that is this string here, not a string. So that we did not convert the data to a string, we did not convert it to JSON. So now this test will succeed if send data request is called with data and it does not reject to this message. If we now run npm test, this fails though, because, well, it did reject because I did change this code in here and I removed the code where this is converted to JSON and therefore to a string. So of course this was wrong though, I want to convert it, so I bring back this code, and after saving this, our test now should also work again. However, it does now fail because this promise now resolves instead of rejecting. And you would think that we're checking for it not rejecting here, but actually what this checks for, and that's really important, is it checks for this not rejecting with this string. But it still expects that this rejects. This is easy to misread, and that's why I'm highlighting it here and why I'm showing it here, because this can easily be misunderstood. This test fails even if the promise does not reject, because it expects it to not reject to this value, not to not reject overall. It still expects it to reject if you're using rejects here. Now that can be very confusing and it leads to a failing test here for us. So therefore there of course is a better way of writing this test where we want to make sure that it does not reject and we're happy if it resolves. And that better way of writing it is to use async and await the response of calling send data request and wrapping this with try catch. With that, we can also catch if the promise rejects, but we also are happy if it resolves. Because now we can add an error message variable, which initially is undefined, but which we set equal to the error we got here, so to the value that was provided after the promise was rejected. So in our case, this not a string. So we store this in error message, but only if we have an error. And then at the end here, we can expect error message to not to be not a string, for example. If we do it like this, it will now pass if the promise resolves. But if I now do not convert it to JSON anymore, the test would fail as expected because we got not a string. And of course, I'll fix this again, but now this will pass again. And this can be super confusing. I just wanted to highlight that not combined with rejects and resolves might not behave the way you do expect it to behave. And therefore, this would be a better way of testing this scenario. Still, we're using our fake fetch function here though, but now also with some added extra logic to easily check whether our function, our production function, does correctly convert values. And we have an easy way of telling in our tests if it does not, with help of this test-specific rejection here. And that is really the mindset you should get into when writing tests, that you really build yourself an environment that allows you to test the parts of your code you want to test.